Great. And here we are with episode 32.
Yep. Yeah, it's another sleepless weekend for me, but
Oh, no.
yeah, hmm yeah, but
Yes, we
it's
were
what
just
it
talking
is,
about
you know.
whether this works for you. It's early morning for you. I'm a night owl, so I don't, it's late at night for me, but that's fine. It doesn't bother
Mm,
me at all.
right, yeah,
But
yeah, but as long as this is not every week, I'm quite all right with this, I think.
no, fair enough. Fair enough. So I've only got one item today. So I'm obviously working on the Victorian Fallacy, my book. It's moving forward. As I do different areas in the book, it usually gives me something that I probably want to talk about. So I'm writing an article for A Voice for Men based on the same information called The Mystical Maids of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And what I'm looking at here is it's quite surprising, actually, that I found a number of mystical maids that I didn't know about. So this is about young women in Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries who at the time they would have called it mystical experiences, now visions, right? Now you and I might suspect that maybe that they had mental health issues, right? Because they were seeing things that weren't there and having and experiencing things that weren't there. In every one of these cases, they involve, now other people may disagree with that even today, but in each one of these cases, they had religious visions. So they all generally involved visions of Jesus Christ and Mary, his mother, and so forth. So one woman I'll get to actually believed that she was actually married to Jesus. So
Yeah.
anyway, what I'm really getting to with these women, and I do, my opinion is they were probably all suffering from some sort of mental illness, which was religious, which got tied into their strong religious beliefs, and that's
Mm,
how they ended up with these mystical visions. But what I really want to highlight, and what I'm talking about in the book, and I'm certainly not making fun of them or anything like that. What I want to talk about, and what I talk about in the book, is that um, these women were actively involved. Now, there are 8 in my list. I haven't completed the article yet. I'm only going to talk about 4 tonight or today. 3 of them were involved in politics. The 4th one doesn't appear to have had any interest in doing so. But it's very clear that when these women had the visions, these were young women, in some cases even girls when they started, they were taken very seriously by the people of their time, and their gender was certainly no impediment to getting the ears of kings and the Pope. A number of them met the Pope, for example.
right.
So, yeah, it's quite a so I'll go. It's quite interesting how how influential they were, and they weren't all wealthy. Some of them were, but one of them was I think the child of a trader or something along those lines, and her family was quite well off, but by no means were they wealthy, nor were they aristocratic. So, as I said, the 8 women that I will eventually get to in the article, but I'm only covering 4 today. And the first one was Bridget of Sweden. She was and jump in at any point for if you've got any thoughts on these women.
Mm,
She was a wealthy married woman who undertook charity work. Now, I found this really interesting. She focused her charity work on single mothers and their children. And this was early 14th century Sweden. Sounds like a very modern problem, doesn't it? So they
mm-hmm.
had a lot of unwed mothers, and this was sort of a social problem they had. And she actually did focus her charity work on them. She was fairly well off. What's interesting, though, she eventually established a religious order, did Bridget of Sweden, and she received financial backing from the King of Sweden, and she even had the ear of the Pope. She actually, at one point, travelled to Rome from Sweden, and she stayed there, I think, for 23 years and ended up dying in Rome. So she obviously had a lot of contact with the Pope while she was there. And what's interesting too, a lot of these things I'd sort of vaguely heard of these people, but I
Mm-hmm.
turned up some interesting information. She actually in a vision, she actually had a picture of Jesus, or like it baby Jesus actually, with a glowing head. And this actually influenced art in her own time. And you've no doubt seen pictures of yourself, baby Jesus with the glowing, head
Yeah.
and so forth. And this continues to influence art up to the present time. And this apparently started with Bridget of Sweden and
It started with
her
her.
yes, exactly. So she was the one who initially said, and when I read it, I went, and I checked a few sources, and they seem to all be saying this is the case. So, yeah, she had this vision, and then that influenced art in her own time, and it's carried through. So, I guess what I really want to highlight here is She's got the ear of, she's got getting financial backing from a king. She's got the ear of the Pope. She's able to influence art, and she's able to assist women, unmarried mothers, and their children. She sounds, not much like an oppressed woman here. So she's able to, even though she was relatively wealthy, nevertheless, she was able to do a lot of this stuff off her own back. Catherine of Siena in Italy is the next one. She lived a little bit later. She refused to marry or enter a convent, which were two things that Italian women did of the time, or sort of more wealthy Italian women. She apparently she did get some pushback from her parents on that, but she dug her heels in and held her ground, and they eventually gave in and said that she could stay unmarried, didn't have to enter a convent. And she was the one who believed that she actually later on, she came to the conclusion she was in fact married to Jesus Christ, and had and you'll love this, she had an invisible wedding ring made of his foreskin. That's actually what she told people. Yeah. So anyway, poor old Catherine might have needed some help that was unavailable in her own time. So, but anyway, that's what she did. But she traveled around. What was interesting is she traveled around Italy with a group of followers. Again, very oppressed here, very oppressed woman, able to travel around Italy on her own, leading a group of people. So, and she was in regular contact with Italian kings and the Pope. And very admirably, she actually used her influence to try to diffuse political tensions on the Italian peninsula, which proves that the kings of Italy were listening to what she had to say. And she also pushed for church reform, but I don't think she was very successful there. So, yeah.
Reform it how?
So I think it was more of a democratization of the church, actually. So that's an area I probably want to dig into a little bit more. But from what I've read, it seemed like she was trying to kind of bring it down a little bit and have more democratization in the church and more influence of the lay people and so forth. And I don't think she was especially successful there, because hundreds of years later, I don't think that was still the case in the Catholic Church. Right. Now Marjorie Kemp is interesting. She was English, and this is in chronological order. So she ran two businesses which failed. So it's interesting. Noah's version, lots of businesses fail. So, but they were home-based businesses, which, as I've said before, a lot of women in the Middle Ages worked, not only in Europe and other societies too. Throughout history, women have predominantly worked. It was quite common for middle class, or sort of not rich, but women so there was a small middle class, but middle class women to run side businesses. So they'd be staying at home. They would be caring for children, but they would often run a side business to try to bring more money into the home while their husband was either working in some job or was perhaps farming. In a lot of cases, they'd be helping on the farms too. But it was quite common for these women to run a side business, which again is something we see a lot of today. So It's very common for women to run. The husband will be working full time, and the wife will be spending her time caring for children, but will also be running a side business trying to bring a little bit of extra money in. Very common arrangement these days. And this is, again, and unfortunately in her case, two of them failed, but she wrote a single book, which was actually believed to be the first autobiography in the English language, which I didn't know before. So, but it was it's considered a religious book talking about her visions and so forth. And apparently, it's even still today considered to be influential in Anglicanism, which of course is a common branch of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm sure I've heard. What is it, Marjorie Kemp?
Marjorie Kemp, yeah, she's probably better known than some of the others.
I'm sure I've heard the name before.
Exactly, that's right. And she's the only one of the four that I'm talking about today who wasn't involved in politics, and I suspect that was because she just didn't have an interest in it. And the final one I want to talk about is very well known, Joan of Arc.
Of course.
So, yep. So she received an audience with the King of France at the age of 17. She appeared on the battlefield. Now, a lot of people think that she fought on the battlefield. Apparently, she did fight a little bit later on, really towards sort of the end of her career. But really, most of the time she was on the battlefield, she was more of a mascot. So what they would do was they would they actually gave her custom-built armor, custom-fitted armor, and they would trot her out on the battlefield. And basically, the presence of Joan of Arc on the battlefield would rally the French troops, and they would fight harder. And one time she was hit with an arrow, and there was a concern she might die. But when she lived, that, of course, was more proof that God was on her side, and boosted the morale again. So feminists claim her to be a proto-feminist, but I've always disagreed with this position. I think she would, as a 15th century woman, I suspect she would have likely found much of feminist ideology to be quite objectionable.
Mm.
So actually, that's all I have tonight. It's very quick. I was on some of these women. As I said, I've got some more that I'm researching. I'll mention the names actually of the other women that I'm researching here.
Yeah.
There's a woman, yeah. So let's see. Yeah, so there's a woman, but I don't have much information on the moment. In fact, I've only got their first names listed here. A woman by the name of Ursulina, another
Yeah.
woman by the name of Constance, and another woman by the name of Marie. And there was an eighth one. Oh, where's the eighth? Oh, and Juliana as well. So I've probably got a little bit more information on them. If I let's see if I can what I've got here. Might have a little more information here. This might be a moment. I was just actually bringing out my information on the
Sure. Well, while you're
the
looking at that, what
yes.
qualifies someone as a mystic exactly?
Right. So that's a good question. So and I have dug into this a little bit because I have found a few other mystics as well. There's even one man that I found from around the same time, but most of them are women. Essentially someone who's seeing visions, so they're seeing and hearing things that aren't there. They're usually sort of all encompassing these visions, probably quite extensive too. And they were of a religious persuasion.
Right.
Was generally the
Gotcha.
nature of them, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I do have a few of the names here. Mary Rabine, who I'll be talking about, a lady by the name of Constance de Rabastens, who I hadn't heard of before actually, despite being quite the history geek. And it's been a little bit hard to find some information on her actually, but I'll be talking a little bit about her. And as I said, the other ones that I mentioned. So 8 in total. I think I'll draw the line there for this article, although I may put more of them in the book. But it's quite interesting, actually. So Joan of Arc actually, so Mary Rabine lived a little bit before Joan of Arc, and Joan of Arc and Mary Rabine predicted the emergence of another mystic maid, right? Other than her, she was obviously one. She predicted another one. Joan of Arc considered herself to be the mystic maid that Mary Rabine had predicted. I don't know. I think Marie had died before Joan was born, so I don't know what Marie would have thought of that. But yeah, Joan of Arc thought of herself as the mystic maid that Marie had predicted. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm also going to be seeing if I can find whether how much they knew about each other, more other than that one particular case. They did live over a period of a little bit of over 100 years. So, but some of them there was some overlap. Yeah, anyway, those are the mystic maids. I found it quite interesting. When I first started the article, I think I only had about 5 or 6 on my list. And as I said, I found another couple. So I'll be presenting 8 in this article. But what I'm really talking about here is how modern some of the problems that they're seeing are, and also to how much influence they had for a society in which women were supposedly oppressed for their gender. Yeah, gotcha. And that's what the Victorian fallacy to a large degree is about. That I guess if there's one point I had to put it into one point, it would be that women have not been oppressed through history. That you could make a case to say the aristocracy was oppressing everybody else in the society, in which case women of the middle and lower classes would have been oppressed, but so were the men. But it wasn't a gender oppression. But I do actually have some of the other points here that I'm going through. I haven't actually announced any of these points yet. So I know I've been talking a lot. Jump in, Vernon, at any stage.
Yep, of course.
Yeah. Cool. So so basically there's a number of points that I haven't publicly stated before actually. So I want to talk about a lot. Obviously, the feminist historical narrative is largely fiction. A high proportion of the population fall for the Victorian fallacy. So the Victorian fallacy is the idea that history was like the Victorian era. There are a number of things that covers that it was very prudish. But on that point, I have to say, even the Victorian era wasn't particularly Victorian. They were outwardly prudish, but there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So not even the Victorian era was Victorian in that regard. But there were a lot of other areas. The idea that women didn't work. I mean, in the Victorian era, women started to leave the workforce in large numbers. But historically, we know women did work. And as we see with Marjorie Kemp, she had a go at running two businesses, for example. So another point I make, and I've made this repeatedly, there are no true patriarchies, not in the sense that feminists mean anyway.
Exactly.
And the feminist notion of patriarchy is a myth. Also, too, there were no true matriarchies. I think we've talked about it on a previous episode, but there was a concept called the ancient matriarchy. It was actually invented by a 19th century European man. Sorry to all the feminists who are listening who are horrified to hear this, but sorry, the matriarchy was actually, concept of the ancient matriarchy was actually invented by a man. And it was then, it had some uptake in his time. His name escapes me right now. We did mention him in a previous episode, and I do have him in the book, but there was some uptake in his time, and it largely disappeared by the late 19th century. And then in the middle of the 20th century, feminists turned up this idea and picked it up and ran with it. So from the 1960s through to really the 1990s, a lot of feminists believed that there was this thing called the ancient matriarchy. From the 1990s onwards, even most feminists will have generally reluctantly agreed that it's nonsense. So the evidence that it was not, there is no evidence that it existed, and the evidence that didn't exist is pretty much overwhelming at this point. So now, the next point I wanted to just make, and I'm mentioning is in the book, is both men and women have been active participants in societies around the world and throughout history. And a lot of the things I'm talking about come back to this, about how women were working, political influence, and an extraordinary number of women had political soft power. Usually they were wealthier and aristocratic women, but that's inevitably the case. That, to a large degree, that's even true today. People who are wealthier have more influence on politics. And societies can be seen to be exploitive of all of their members. So, yes, certainly societies were exploiting women, but they're exploiting men too. And I think this really links to male disposability, because to a large degree, a lot of the exploitation of men resulted in their death.
Exactly.
Yeah. And one of the points I can jump in for you to.
Sure. I'm trying.
Oh, am I? Sorry, I'm not giving you a chance. I'm not giving you a chance to jump in.
No. I'm just waiting for that right opportunity.
Oh, no worries. Okay, cool.
Early for me.
Oh, no worries. And I contend the Western society is returning to the historical norm of men working full-time and women working part-time and caring for children. And this is reflected in, for example, again, Marjorie Kemp's attempts at businesses. It was very common. Historians recognize it as being common that women worked, that women ran small businesses, usually not in a full-time, often not in a full-time capacity, often in a part-time capacity. And I think that this is the historical norm, and at least since the adoption of agriculture, and we left it for a while, and I think now we're returning to it, which I think really speaks to the power of these sort of social pressures on that this is a sort of almost like a low energy state for humanity, and we tried to diverge from it, and I think it's not working, and I think we're coming back to it. So men generally seek to protect and give priority to the needs of women and children. This is obviously gynocentrism, and we see it in a lot of societies, and we see it in our own society. And as I've said before, women are safer with men around. Whenever I say that, feminists get really ballistic and call me all sorts of horrible names. But for much as they want to say that they're afraid of men and so forth, the reality is they're safe with men around, because men are far more likely to help women than ever to attempt to harm women. And if a man does try to harm a woman, for example, it'll be the other men around who will likely be stopping them. And I think this is true throughout history, and we still see it today. So, of course, Peter Wright has talked a lot about the drivers behind that, and this really picking up steam in medieval Europe and so forth. I think it has existed previously, but I think there's strong evidence, as Peter says, that it's really picked up steam in medieval Europe.
Right.
the relative power of women has varied considerably among societies in the ancient world. So relative to men, there were societies where I would say women probably had less freedoms and so forth relative to men. But in other societies, there was almost no difference in some cases. And so I think you can't paint with a broad stroke here. You have to talk about individual societies. If feminists want to criticize a particular society and say that, women in Athens had restricted rights, by all means, do that. Have that conversation, talk about it, and let's look at ancient Athens, right? But that's where, because in ancient Athens, I've read that women couldn't, there was restricted opportunity for them a lot of the time to leave the house and so forth. Maybe that's not as true as sometimes the historians claim, but in contrast, Spartan women at the time had a relatively large amount of freedom. So, but often they will just try to pick these particular examples and then paint a broad brush all across your history, and you can't do that.
Exactly. I just don't trust a lot of modern depictions one way or another because they're probably going to be feminist influenced. So it's kind of
Absolutely.
hard to find good sources on a lot of this stuff, I think.
You are absolutely right. Absolutely. And I'm actually increasingly adopting the position that professional historians, you really have to question their ideological drive. And I think the only genuine historical research now is coming out of people who aren't doing it for money. They're the amateur historians, because and that includes me. I would consider myself an amateur historian. Peter Wright is, and others as well. And we're doing it because we believe it's important to this information to be released. There's no financial influence. In fact, and I'll say it right here, AVFM receives some donations, but it doesn't cover the running costs, and I pay the rest out of pocket. So we're not doing it. We're not doing it for the money. There's no financial influence there at all. We're doing it because we think it's important.
Exactly.
And
No,
I absolutely 100%. Yeah.
right, yeah.
Historians.
Yeah. So even as an amateur historian, so where would you actually kind of go for this kind of information? Is it just more antiquated sources, basically, or is
So
there some use in online sources as well, or?
yeah, so primary sources where feasible. It's not always feasible though, especially if the information is in another language. Unfortunately, it's necessary to rely on the work of professional historians to some extent. So I think it's what I do is I read what they're saying, and I cross-check with other sources. And there's always a healthy dash of skepticism in there. And of course, you can see the bias too. If the bias is sort of anti-male, then you've got to consider that possibility that. So if what they're saying is anti-male, you've got to consider the possibility of a bias in there. But if they're saying that it's something that is actually supporting men, for example, then there's a it's less likely to be biased information, in the sense that their natural position won't be to be positive about men in a lot of cases. Good example of that is the proportion of European monarchs who were queens, which I think was about 80%. Don't quote me on that, but about 80%, I think it was. Now that's just raw data, right? Now the authors of a particular study showed that queens were much more common, and they also showed that they were much more likely to go to start wars and continue wars than kings, as we know. They then tried, so that's something that the raw data shows, right? They then tried to explain it away in various ways. And that's where I think you really go to some skepticism, because they said, for example, that their argument was that queens received, that a king was more a king regnant, or a king that was the wife of a queen king who was wife of a queen regnant, the queen who rules in her own right, was more likely to be involved in the government, because the queen would involve him in the running of the country, versus a queen consort who had no power. They were trying to claim that the kings wouldn't involve them so much in the running of the country. I think that's not true, and I think the historical record shows that isn't true, since queen consorts were often involved in the running of the country. But they tried to claim that was one of the differences that accounted for this difference in queens being able to start wars more often. They said the king was taking a load, her husband was taking a greater load of the running of the country, and that freed her up to wage war, basically, was their argument, I think. But I don't actually agree with that argument. I think that the historical record shows that queens consort were very active in the in the running of the country. But that's an example where they try to, so they present the raw data, and the raw data is what it is. And to be fair, they're not modifying the data because that would be academic fraud, right?
Hmm.
I think that's still relatively uncommon. What they do though is they try to sort of bend the results and the interpretation after the data. So if you go and look at the data, you get the good information. But then you have to look at their conclusions and take that sometimes with a grain of salt,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Now, is there such a thing as an unbiased historian?
No, and we all have biases,
Yeah.
absolutely, and I think it's a question of admitting them, and
Yeah.
that's certainly something where I'd say we're very open about our biases. If you look at my Twitter profile, you will see that I describe myself as an MRA and an activist and an anti-feminist,
Yes.
and I make it clear that I run a Voice for Men. A Voice for Men. We have policy documents. I put several policy documents up. There's all the articles there. We're very clear about what we're doing and saying, but our opponents tend to be quite evasive,
Hmm.
which I've long called feminist superposition.
Hmm.
Some
Yeah.
people are saying Schrödinger is feminist, but I don't like that because the the physicist I did the physics when I was younger, physicist in me prefers to call it
Yeah.
feminist superposition. So quantum
Right.
mechanics.
Sure. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, the whole Schrodinger's cat thing was an absurd concept in itself anyway. It was admitted that it was meant to be absurd. So
Well, of course, exactly. It's just a thought experiment, and they
yeah.
do thought experiments, and they help understand the concepts, but you can't
Hmm.
push them in the analogy in them too far.
Right.
That's right. Yeah,
Right. 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 Yeah.
but yeah, I call it feminist superposition because they're not in a defined state until you try to interact with them, and then then they'll go to whatever state is most convenient for them at that point.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like one thing I kind of wanted to do some research on that I want to kind of find some real solid information on is material on Auguste Comte. Um, yeah, coiner of the word altruism and also a big time gynocentrist, by the way.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
He was one of the big pushers of like the female driven kind of rule of society, basically. But and I've been wanting to uh, make an article, at least some kind of publication, uh, analyzing the connection between his altruism advocacy and that of his gynocentrism advocacy.
Ah,
Um,
right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I kind of want to find some material about the person himself and try and kind of actually work on that one. I know Peter Wright's been speaking about Comte in as much as the gynocentrism part, but the 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 fact that he's a corner of altruism is like the big other thing about Comte that needs to be talked about some more, right?
Yeah, and you want to dig down into his personal life and so forth, and perhaps see if there are influences in there. Is that what you're
Yeah,
thinking?
exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And I know people are going to be bothered by this, but I'm no fan of altruism at all because I don't think it's compassion.
Yeah, it's altruism is actually a really interesting concept. So, if you do something for someone else and you know you're going to feel good about it, there's an argument that the act wasn't really altruistic because you knew
Um,
you get a benefit.
exactly. Well, there's two ways to interpret this. The basically you derive no benefit, or you have to do something at your expense. That to
Oh, okay.
right, yeah.
Yes.
That's as far as I can understand is the proper definition of altruism, and it's not actually compassion because you know compassion is about alignment with one's own values. You know that you hold as an entailment of your own self-interest. It's
That's
not
interesting
just
because
it's self-interest is not just you know every man for himself or anything like that. Not really, and not in line with self-interest anyway. So
yeah, and
yeah, you
there's
were
some
saying?
interesting. I was saying the definition of altruism that I've generally used is it was just that. Yeah, the uh, that I do something and I don't benefit from it, but you're saying there's actually a cost aspect in there. That's interesting. Yes, and in terms of selfishness, yeah, there's some interesting argument that's been some interesting research that's been done in evolutionary biology about selfishness and so forth, and how group protection can be a form of enlightened self-interest from a genetic point of view, from passing on some of your genes. If you can't pass on all of your genes or half of them,
Well,
you might still be able to pass on some of them, for example.
yeah, it's not a very conscious thing, so this is why I'm not really keen on the evolutionary biologist argument of basically group interest, basically,
Yeah.
because I think what we're talking about here when we're talking about self-interest is for the human being and his own existential standing in the world, basically. This is only for the animal that can think about his own meaningfulness in his life, his own standing in the world, and what can he do for himself as a character, basically, not just a part of a species. That's it. So
Mm.
yeah, I'm
A
very
lot.
stubborn on this subject, by the
No,
way.
good.
So yeah.
A lot of the work on evolutionary biology has been about non-human organisms too. So it's not necessarily, I guess that's probably perhaps even their focus too. Um, but anyway, so I find the whole area very interesting though.
Mm, right. Yeah.
So yeah, interested to hear what you have to say on altruism. Have you written articles on that before? I don't
Well, I mean, it's
recall.
part of it was one of my first entry into this whole thing before I was even a part of Voice for Men. Yeah. I think it was the thing that got me into the first ICMI. Actually, I didn't recite it or anything like that, but
Yeah.
I think that was like a big recommendation. I think Paul gave it a thumbs up. I don't know how it got because I don't because I still think altruism is a bit of a something something people consider to be just plain old compassion, but it's one of those things. So I'm not sure how I got that this far by doing something so unpopular, but here I am.
Yes, we're never afraid to look at new ideas and have our ideas challenged, and that's something that's consistent across our society, about
Mm,
across men's rights, and across the wider group of people that we keep in touch with. And there are disagreements, and that's okay. And sometimes even heated, debates and so forth. Where not where there's anger involved, but where people are quite passionate about it,
mhm,
and that's okay. Whereas in contrast, I find our opponents tend to suffer quite a bit from groupthink.
exactly. And I want to point something out. I know people like to call women, especially the feminist gynocentric type women, selfish, but I have a different perspective on that.
Mm.
If these women are basically acting as parasites, and they have only thoughts of the whims of the moment, and then they have basically kind of riding on the coattails of anyone successful, and they're basically how do I put it? Kind of mentally just kind of drifting. They don't really have a sense of identity, and instead replace it with just manipulation of people to kind of get by. Then to someone like me, that's almost the opposite of selfish. Actually, it's
Mhm.
kind of devoid of self as possible in that
Mhm.
yeah. So that's the kind of argument I would make. I know they're talking about narcissism, which is something I define distinctly from rational
From
selfishness.
selfish.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
which is another article in itself. So there's a lot coming in the future. It's just yeah, a lot to get through.
Yeah, absolutely. There is. I've been writing my book for a number of years now. It's actually 7 years. So I certainly hear you. And I'm actually, as I said, I'm writing an article on this, and even this is taking me quite a while to do.
Hmm.
And speaking of narcissism too, yeah, I don't want to go around disrespecting people who've been dead for hundreds of years, but I couldn't help thinking when Catherine of Siena said she was married to Jesus Christ,
Yeah,
that there wasn't a bit of an element of narcissism in there.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So narcissism to me is incredibly socially conscious to me. It's about social standing and not really about personal conviction or anything like that. It's about what others think of you and you kind of fancying yourself as the object of everyone's desire in that
Mm.
way. So there's a really parasitic aspect of narcissism that uh, it kind of gets confused as rational egoism, basically.
And narcissism is actually broader than I had previously. I've done a bit of reading on it recently, and it's actually broader than I had previously realized. I mean, people think of the narcissist as the showy character who wants to be the center of attention all the time and so forth, but there are actually other sorts of narcissism as
Right.
well, where they're not necessarily so overtly showy, but they're
Mhm.
still narcissistic, yeah,
Right.
and still inevitably difficult to deal with, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of a belief in one's own perfection, I think.
Yes, exactly. That's right. And quite a lot of narcissists are very intolerant of criticism of any form, even constructive criticism, for example,
Right. Yeah.
because yeah, it attacks that self-image of perfection.
Exactly.
That's
Right.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a few more points
Yeah. Sure.
just to do with the book. I thought this is actually the first time I've actually spoken about them, all of them publicly, and some of them I haven't spoken
Right.
about them at all. But I will be going forward. You'll be seeing more articles on these points and so forth. Then soon enough, the book will be published. So, next one is to demonstrate progress towards egalitarian society involves advancing the political power and education of all people, not just women. There's a common trope that is often repeated, whereas a society is advancing or the birth rate is falling or something along those lines, they say it relates to the education of women. Now, I have not found any solid evidence that that is the case. Education in general, yes, but I haven't found any solid evidence that it's related specifically to the education of women. So, if anybody has got any information that says it's specifically related to the education of women and not education of society generally, please tell me about it because I'm very interested. You can post it as a comment in the video, or you can reach me at a voice for men. So,
Right.
and on Twitter, whatever. So I would be
Exactly.
very
And
interested to hear this about this.
right. Right. And if you're leaving a comment in our video, sometimes it might take us, it depends on the comment. I'm not sure what the criteria is, but sometimes it'll take a bit for us to actually kind of see it. Like recently, there's been a comment by a thoughtful comment, by the way. It was a good comment by Ashley Messenger. I think that was the person's name. And I had to kind of look into my own managed video section to actually see the comments sometimes. And
Okay.
I noticed that in the comment you were kind of fudging some of the words to kind of get past YouTube censors or something. Clearly, I don't know how well that helped, but
That's unfortunate. Yeah.
exactly. But uh, should there be like a email for that we should put out for feedback that will otherwise be missed by a YouTube comment, Rob?
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. There is, I guess I can say it on the video because that's unlikely to be picked up by the spammers too much. But an email address you can use for a voice for men is info@voiceformen.com. And we might set up one. We might consider setting a separate one up, perhaps for this.
Maybe.
But that one will certainly work, and I'll see any email that goes to that address.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, yep. But yeah,
We do.
we do appreciate the comments. So keep them coming. It really makes this worth it.
Absolutely. So my next one is, and this is one that I haven't seen really mentioned anywhere else, and I'm contending this, and I think the mystics that I talked about in this episode speak to this, as do lots of other references that I make in the book. When women take on typically male roles, men generally let them. And that really runs counter. This, by the one, is a hypothesis I only developed while I was writing the book. I didn't have this at the beginning, but as I researched the very many situations around the world that I was talking about and the men and women involved, I definitely saw this coming out as a trend where, and one of my challenges in the book will be to sufficiently convey this, but time and time again, when there are women who want to take on a traditionally male role and who are, I would contend, capable of doing so. So there are probably women who aren't capable of doing so.
Mhm.
They're probably unsuccessful, just as men would be. But if the men around them believe that they've got the capability and they want to do it, the men around them have generally let them do it. And you can really see this in people um, like Catherine of Siena, for example, where she didn't want to marry And her parents said, okay, fine. There was some reluctance there initially, but they said fine. And she ended up wandering around with a group of followers in Italy, for example, or Bridget, who was able to found an order and who was able to go and see the Pope and just live in Rome. And granted, these are somewhat more wealthy women, but generally people who are more wealthy, men or women, have greater flexibility and greater mobility and so forth. Joan of Arc is a classic one. I mean, she was a peasant actually, and she ended up getting an audience with the king. And there are lots of other cases too, which I'll talk about separately, and I think have talked about a little bit in the past. But this is something that really was driven home to me, that the men by and large, and this is something feminists say is absolutely not the case. They claim that men actively resist women taking on male roles until quite recently. And I just don't think that's true at all. And I don't think the historical record shows it to be true. Yeah.
I need to interject here. If Joan of Arc were male, would this person have found any audience with the king?
So that's an additional point, exactly. So I was talking more generally there, but you're right. In terms of the mystics, it seems to be an advantage to being a woman. At least that's the way. I haven't done as much research in this area, but that certainly seems to be the case. Yeah, there are certainly a lot more female mystics than male mystics, and if anything, they're probably being taken a bit more seriously. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
More generally, that may not be the case, but I think in this particular case, yeah, I think that is the case.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, another example, for example, the Ptolemies is another example I've written on. I've written an article on A Voice for Men for this, and I've talked about it in one of the ICMI presentations. The Ptolemies, most people may not know who the Ptolemies were, but you have heard of Cleopatra. Well, her name was Cleopatra Ptolemy, to the extent that she had her 13th great grandfather, or thereabouts, 12th, 13th great grandfather. It was 13 generations anyway, was named Ptolemy. And he was a king of Greece, king of Egypt. So he was Greek, but he was a king of Egypt. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and what Alexander would do is he would conquer a country, put one of his generals on the throne as the king, and the king would swear loyalty to him as the emperor of the Macedonian Empire, and Alexander would move on and do it again. And so the Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 300 years. There were a number of important women in the Ptolemy family that were very important to Egypt and the running of Egypt. I've talked about this all before, but Cleopatra and one of her sisters, Berenice, was also very powerful as well. I think Berenice overthrew her father at one point, and these women were active and they were followed. So this comes back to this situation where you have here women of the royal house in Egypt, and they stand up and they say, "No, I'm running things," and the men around them are like, "Yeah, okay." Time and time again, you see it. So as I said, I've got a lot of examples like this in the book, but yeah, that article was actually called The Ptolemies, a Soap Opera, because honestly, when you start to read about the Ptolemies, and it's really kind of a shame, Cleopatra, the story of Cleopatra has been done to death, right? But the rest of the story of the Ptolemies, it really we need a good production of that, I think, in a series or something, because it's absolutely fascinating. And Cleopatra was Greek. Okay, her father was definitely Greek. There's a high probability her mother was Greek. Her mother may have been from somewhere else in Eurasia, but not Egypt, maybe in Eurasia. But she was either Greek or half Greek, and I think there may have been, I can't recall the potential ethnicity of her mother, but she was definitely, her mother was not an Egyptian, but probably Greek anyway. But Cleopatra did speak the Egyptian language though.
Sure.
But yeah, she was most definitely not from Africa. She was Greek, and of course the Egyptian government is taking a hard stance on this at the moment over the documentary that was produced recently, where it was asserted that Cleopatra came from Africa, and she most definitely did not. She was of Greek descent, so at least half it, probably 100% Greek. So
yeah, you got to watch out for those modern documentarians.
Exactly, that's right, exactly. So they're just like the historians, unfortunately, today. There's a strong ideological streak.
Exactly.
So the next one that I want to put, excuse me, ancient societies balanced gender rights and responsibilities. Any society that did not do this was unstable. and would either correct or be replaced. So that's my contention, that there was a balance of rights and responsibilities, and male disposability was at a level that we would not find acceptable today. But my contention is it was balanced with status and so forth. So yes, men had to take greater risks, but they were rewards for it. That's my contention. And these societies were stable, and that ours is unstable. And that if there were unstable societies in the past, I think they either corrected or replaced. And I think that we're facing that again. If we don't stabilize the society, our society will be replaced by a society which has gender rights and responsibilities balanced.
Hmm. Right. Was it ever taken seriously though, like men as human beings, in the context that we're trying to advocate for them?
Perhaps not in the sense that we're arguing today.
Right.
I'm not sure that it was. They certainly had status, but and they would, and there was, like, for example, the term patriarchy. The original meaning of the term patriarchy is a society in which fathers rule the family, and in that sense, for example, ancient Rome was a patriarchy, right? But it's not a, but it was not a patriarchy, nor were there any patriarchies in the sense that feminists mean, where a society in which men systematically oppress women. And feminists, I'm absolutely sure, rely on this confusion between the terms, where, of course, there were patriarchies. They'd say, we know this, Rome was a patriarchy,
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
in the sense they mean. They mean it only in the traditional sense. So in that sense, yes, men often had more power in, say, the family in a lot of societies, not all, but a lot
Hmm.
in a lot of societies. And that somewhat counterbalanced the risks they were taking. Not that I would say that's acceptable for men today, but I think there was at least they got something for it. But I don't think that you saw a lot of that sort of men are human in the sense that we would like to see it today.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
And next point I want to make is many ancient societies had an understanding of men, women, and gender relations that is today largely gone. I think that a lot of societies were quite realistic about the nature of men and the nature of women and the way that they tended to behave. And particularly since World War II, we've tried to throw this away for some reason.
Mm.
And I'll say it again. And I know this is a point, and I think you were skeptical when I suggested this before, and I want to sort of complete this area actually of my work and start presented in an episode. But a lot of ancient societies believed that women were more driven by sex than men.
Mm.
And that was a very common belief. Medieval Europe believed it. Many ancient societies believed it. The idea that women got more pleasure from sex than men was also one that was fairly common in ancient societies as well.
Mhm.
So these were ideas that our ancient ancestors accepted as normal, and it's something that today is considered to be heretical.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the source of my skepticism when it comes to that notion is so should they have, if they desire it more, shouldn't they have less control over the matter? Should it be cartelized vastly to their advantage in that respect? If you get what I mean.
Well, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Some societies it was actually fairly balanced. So, I mean, in a lot of societies, yeah, I mean, this is a separate issue to whether women initiate sex or not. I mean, this is actually really interesting because
Right.
in our society, in modern Western civilization, we live in a society in which women participate in a wide variety of virtually every aspect of society. Until recently, women weren't in combat, but that's largely gone now. There are less female politicians than male politicians, but I would contend that's largely down to choice. But despite all this, and this is something that a lot of people have pointed out, men still ask women out. And while the proportion of women who ask men out may have increased a little bit, it's still not very common. There's an historical trend. There is a particular term for it that escapes my memory now, but there is a particular phenomenon that's been observed where women signal interest to men, and the men then respond to the interest and
Hmm.
ask the women out, right? And
Right. Yeah.
some historians and psychologists and so forth have contended that was actually pretty much the normal way of doing things until quite recently.
Mm.
So the
Yeah.
women wouldn't ask the men out, but they would make it clear to the men they were interested,
Hmm.
so that when the man asked her out, he had nearly 100% hit rate. right? Because
Right.
so that cut down the risk a lot too. So
Hmm.
he was pretty sure that she was interested before he
Hmm.
even tried, right? And
Right.
this was a
Right.
fairly right, and they contend this is fairly common. So in that regard, I would suggest that while women weren't they weren't sort of, jumping the bones of the guy, as it were,
Hmm.
right? They would have been more subtle in their application of it, but I think that they were still very active. And if you look at somewhere like medieval Europe, which is a particular area I have spent quite a bit of time on recently, they had something called the marital debt. And the marital debt meant that both spouses had to have sex with the other when when the one wanted it. So if the wife wanted sex, the husband had to, and vice versa. So feminists will say, oh, women had to have sex whenever their husbands wanted. Well, that was actually technically true. But what they failed to mention was the reverse was true as
Hmm.
well in
Right.
medieval Europe. So, and the marital debts idea, I think, probably died out sometime in the Renaissance. But this was, I think I have mentioned this before in a previous episode. But so I think if women wanted to have sex, that they probably would initiate sometimes, or they would, and so certainly sometimes they would initiate,
Hmm.
but other times they would probably signal their interest, for example, and it might be the man who initiates because he feels, particularly under the marital debt, he would essentially be obligated to then have sex with
Hmm.
his wife after she's indicated her interest. So, and I think I mentioned previously there was a guy whose wife wanted sex so much he actually wrote to the church and asked for guidance, and they wrote back and basically said, "You married her, suck it up." So they were having sex 15 times a day, I believe he was complaining. So
Hmm.
I can't imagine he had time. I hope he didn't work for a living because I can't imagine he had time for much else.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Well,
yeah,
this
but
kind
of
of
course we got
yeah, this sort of kind of throws a wrench into the whole idea of women being much more guarded in terms of like their sexual activities. Kind of traditional conservatives kind of go the route of, since that the women are the ones that get pregnant, they are rather like horribly picky and actually initiate this sort of things very seldom.
yeah.
Yeah, it kind
Um,
of throws
I
a
mean, this doesn't roll. This still doesn't roll the possibility of women being more picky than men, but it doesn't necessarily. But I think that's probably overemphasized. I suspect. Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, of course, in medieval Europe, despite their tolerance of sex, we're talking tolerance of sex in marriage. So
Right.
the society was intolerant of sex outside marriage in general. Uh, Renaissance Europe, certainly Renaissance England in particular, the generally if a couple were engaged, they called it handfasted, but if they were engaged, it was generally considered to be acceptable. They didn't endorse it, and they didn't particularly like it, but they accepted it. That in couples who were engaged were generally having sex. And when William Shakespeare got married, his wife, who happens to be called Anne Hathaway,
Mhm.
was pregnant, and historians estimate that a third of the brides were pregnant on their wedding day at the time. So there was certainly widespread tolerance for, but again, this is tolerance for women who are and men who are engaged, not necessarily, they're not sleeping around, where the society would be very intolerant of that, even though
Mhm.
it happened. It still
Yeah.
happened. But yeah, that was something that would still have to be under the table to a large degree.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it is interesting. You have these different aspects where women aren't necessarily still as overt in initiating, but they're still able to get the message across within the confines acceptable to their society, which would be marriage to a large degree.
Mhm.
But they're still that doesn't rule that alone. The fact that they're more passive in initiating alone doesn't rule out the possibility that they're just as interested in sex, or at least as interested in sex as the men.
Right.
In fact, there was some recent research I read that suggested that women were not initiating even when they really wanted it, which is quite interesting.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
So it could be that more passive signaling. And I think getting back to the point I was making, I think our ancient ancestors kind of understood this stuff and sort of had it down. And
Yeah.
we're the ones who are really messed up with it, I think. Our society's quite messed up. We've lost a lot of there was some ancient wisdom there that
Mhm.
things that people understood to be true, and
Right.
we've gone and messed it up, I think. And it's
Right.
largely for
Yes. I think the modern kind of way to look at this, the modern gynocentric way to kind of interpret the sexual relationship and how things get initiated. I think men are told basically told by social cues that, if you refuse sex, you're an idiot, or
Mm,
this is your one chance, you better take it, or you're just a chump,
yeah,
or so, right? Yeah,
yeah,
and so
absolutely.
yeah, and this kind of leads to really bad situations in which they kind of involve themselves with women that are on the crazy side, or otherwise kind of dangerous,
Yeah,
and so they could probably get themselves into some bad relationships because of it, because of that opportunity, and they get trapped in the marriage, in modern marriage, on that basis.
yeah.
So
Rather
there's
than
a yeah.
really waiting for the woman that they really want. And I really do believe that. I think if you look at the historical record too, you see that there are plenty of situations where men willingly choose to go without sex for long periods of time.
Mhm.
This whole idea of men being horn dogs and wanting it all the time, it's a pretty recent concept. It really is. As I said, many societies historically argued that women had more sex drive than men, higher libido. Uh,
Mhm.
and if you look historically, you see there are large periods of time when a lot of men choose and in the modern day too,
Yeah.
these men I think probably are not perhaps very visible. But if you
Right.
stop, what I suggest is go down to the street, go to a mall or something like that, and just watch people, and you can and look at people, whether older people, younger people, and ask yourself, the older guy, the nerdy younger guy, these guys really, chasing it all the time? I don't think
Mhm.
they are. I just
Right.
don't think it's up to observation today, let alone,
Mhm.
as I said, the historical record where
Right.
you
Yeah.
see.
Mhm.
And by the way, I was just going to say only about in the US, around 14 to 16% of men visit a prostitute at some point in their life.
Mhm.
So, and about 1% of men have visited a prostitute in the last 12 months. So I would contend visiting a prostitute is not a typical male behavior. It's
Mhm.
something that a relatively small percentage of men, I would suspect that 1% is probably 1 or 2% of men who do it a lot.
Mhm.
And most other men, I suspect, are not really doing it. There's a number of examples like that where things that are claimed to be typical male behaviors that I would suggest are not.
Oh
But
yeah.
I think, yeah, and it's often sometimes they use visiting prostitutes as an example of why men pay for sex and women don't. Well, actually, the majority of men don't pay for sex. Around 84 to 86% of American men have never paid for sex, right?
Mhm.
And
Well, not
99,
not in the way we understand it anyway. I mean,
sorry, yeah,
I can kind.
I've not paid cash.
Right, yeah, right.
Okay, good touche. And 99% of American men have not paid cash for sex in the last year. So
Mm-hmm.
they're not typical male behaviors. And yes, more men than women will put down their credit card for sex. Although even that's not as different as people would
Hmm.
believe. But the majority of men don't do it.
Right.
In the United States, 84 to 86% of men have never done it.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Right. So, I mean, even if the postulate is true, that basically women have a higher sex drive, I still don't think men's sex drive is particularly low. That I don't think that's the right way to really
No, I'm
interpret that.
not
Yeah.
trying to argue it's
Yeah.
low. It might even
Yeah.
be the same. Okay, that's within the
I
sort of
prefer that. I prefer
right.
the same, actually.
That's so. What I'm saying is, many ancient societies argued that women had a higher sex drive. It could be that we find it's the same. I think there are other aspects like the tendency of women not to initiate, which confuse the issue. I think that's
Right.
really where the problem is. We might find it's the same. Also, there's another aspect too. We know the reproductive pill reduces the female sex drive, right? And a
Mm.
significant proportion of women are on the pill, and a much higher proportion of sexually active women are on the pill. And we're
Mm.
doing it at a societal level. So we may have an observer bias where
Yeah.
we're looking at a society where a large proportion of women are on the pill, which we know reduces their sex
Yeah.
drive. And then we go, women don't have any sex drive. Well, I wonder why that might be.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe.
And it's a bit of a paradox that they haven't kind of solved when it comes to the pill. Like I'm not anti the pill, but
No, neither am I.
right, right. But excuse me. But I think they just threw it out and pretended it solved everything. There's nothing, it's
Mm.
like kind of like that software can do no wrong kind of a thing. It kind of believes
Yes.
in like the 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 holiness and like the perfection of such a thing, but
And
it could
we both know that's
stand to
not true as
be
well.
right, right, exactly. But the point I'm making is they've stopped looking at the bugs on this thing. And if
Yes,
you look at the bugs, the proverbial bugs of the pill, you know, they kind of it's verboten to kind of question it. Else you're against women's reproductive choices or whatever. But it's okay to kind of pick out some flaws and try and improve on them. Maybe back off on some of the really bad ones.
absolutely.
So yeah, exactly.
I'm really a fan of Vessel Gel excuse me, and other non-hormonal male
Yeah.
reproductive male contraceptive tools. For those who don't know, Vessel Gel is a polymer which is injected into the vas deferens, which is the tube that goes between the
Hmm.
testicles and the penis, and it would physically block the sperm from going through. I think actually it partially closes it, and the sperm basically die as they come through.
Hmm.
So they've demonstrated it works. The problem, the only reason they haven't gone to market yet is they're proving that it's reversible. I would think that it might have made sense to go to market without the reversibility. There still would have been a market, and that would have allowed the money to come in, which they could have then used to then
Yeah.
research the reversibility. I think they should have gone to market and said, we don't know if it's reversible or not. You take your chances, and there still would be a
Yeah.
huge market for it. Uh, if that's by the way, there's another one called Rysug, which is being developed in India. I think is last I checked, Rysug was only available in India, and I think that's the original Vassal Gel may have been based on the Rysug research as well. So, but Vassal Gel is being developed in the US and for a global market. My hope is that Vassal Gel really takes off and that women actually start going off the pill because now the men are on Vassal Gel. The problems with the pill, which are affecting women but indirectly affecting men as well, uh, will start to dissipate. Okay, because having such a large proportion of population on hormonal reproduction or replacement may not have been such a great idea. Even though I like the pill in principle, absolutely,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. But the problem is the problem is the devil's in the details, as they say.
Mm.
So
Right.
I think if we shifted to a society where Vassal Gel was the norm, that solves a number of problems. Men can no longer be subject to paternity fraud, or at least paternity fraud would be extremely unusual, at least to any men who were choosing to use. I suppose it could still happen if the man has gone off he's gone off Vassal Gel and had a child, he could still be subject to paternity fraud at that point. But for a lot of men, it will protect them against paternity fraud. So I shouldn't say it won't be virtually extremely unlikely, but it will be it will be significantly reduced. The risk of it will be significantly reduced. So men will be protected there. The problems associated with the pill, which have impacted both men and women, directly or indirectly, would be gone or massively reduced. So I think Vassal Gel is a win-win all round. I've heard some people argue that men would not allow themselves to be injected in the vas deferens. I think this is a really odd argument because a vasectomy is a much more invasive procedure, also
Yeah,
conducted on the vas deferens, and it's
like
really
if you're
common.
not used to the idea, I get why you'd be kind of squeamish, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But a large proportion of men already elect to have a vasectomy, and a
Hmm.
vasectomy is an operation on the vas deferens. So it's a lot more intrusive than a simple needle into the vas deferens. So I would suggest
Yeah,
any man who's having a vasectomy, is willing to have a vasectomy, would be willing to use Vasogel. And there are probably men who are willing to use Vasogel that maybe wouldn't have wanted a vasectomy. So
right, yeah.
yeah, especially when there are reports of problems with vasectomies and so forth. So Vasogel as I said, they're researching the reversibility at the moment, but what they believe is the case is that a saline solution injected into the vas deferens will dissolve the polymer. So
Okay.
yeah, they were the last I heard, I think it was 5 years. They were hoping to get 10, but I think they're looking at least 5 years. So there'd be once every 5 years the man would go back for the procedure, unless he
Okay.
was after some number of years, perhaps he's decided he wants to have children, and maybe then just lets it naturally fade away. So. But yeah, every 5 years, perhaps the man will be going back and having this injection done.
Right, exactly. So one hypothesis I've got is that, you know, uh, you know, we still have this kind of abortion problem, despite the fact of the pill being so out there. You know, you'd think uh, this would be completely bypassed, the abortion thing,
Yeah, still very
you know,
common.
but it
That's
isn't.
right.
But so I guess the reason why the pill isn't used so much is because it kind of goes to what you're saying about women's libido. I think they want to have that libido, and
Mm.
maybe in some kind of subconscious way, they know that the pill is affecting it. So maybe they go off it and end up, you know, you
I
kind
think
of
in
get what I'm
some
saying
cases,
here? Yeah.
yes, and in some cases it's quite explicit actually. I've even read a number of posts from women online, for example, where they've said, "I know the pill is affecting my libido,
Hmm.
and I'm very unhappy about it."
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that's fairly common. And they say, "I'm happy about it for myself, and I'm also unhappy about it for my husband or boyfriend or whatever." So
Mm.
yeah, I think that is a very common thing, and you're probably right. There's probably some women where it's less overt, but there are certainly at least some where they're well aware of this, and then they may choose other alternatives. Of course, women have a number of other alternatives for contraception, but Vassal gel would solve this problem, I think, for everybody. Now, some women have said they wouldn't necessarily want to trust the man to be responsible for the contraception, which is interesting because, on the other hand, some feminists have said we want men to be responsible for this. But anyway, uh, unlike the pill, it doesn't require any active use. So as long as the man can confirm that he's had it within the last, say, 3 to 4 years, it presumably would be effective. So it's not like yesterday, he forgets the pill, and then he's not covered for a month, as can be the case with a women's pill, or 2 weeks or whatever.
Mhm.
In the case of Vassal, it would be, as long as he's not lying, he would be infertile during that period. And it's improbable. I think it would be the rare man who would lie in order to try to get a woman pregnant.
Yeah,
So
that's kind of, yeah.
for various reasons that we've talked about before. So having said that, if the women were still not sure, then I'd suggest another alternative as well. But the Vassal gel, I think, is something that men need to adopt
Mm.
in large numbers.
Yep.
So I've got two final points. These are the
All right.
two. I've got 16 points total that I'm going through in the book. The two final
Mm.
points are the penultimate one. Love that word.
Yep.
Is the social struggle since the appearance of agriculture has been a class struggle rather than a gender struggle, as feminists would have us
Mm.
believe. Now, when I say class struggle, everyone thinks, "Oh, Marxist," right?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, but and I may reword that, but in a sense, it's true insofar as I think it's absolutely true that when you look at historical societies, the upper classes were absolutely oppressing the rest of the society
Mm.
and extracting as much as they possibly could from them,
Right.
and often giving very little back. They may have been giving protection or something, but by funding the army or whatever, they tried to. They was certainly the relationship was biased in their favor. So that's a point I'm making, that it is something that would have been obvious to a lot of people until recently. It's not a class, it's not a gender struggle.
Hmm.
It's a struggle of different social classes.
Right.
And the final one, and this is not related to gender or anything. The Industrial Revolution never ended. I
Mm.
recently heard someone talk about the fourth or fifth Industrial Revolution or something. It is my contention that we are still in the Industrial Revolution. It
Hmm.
started in the 18th century and it's still happening. We're still experiencing a period of rapid change that's been going on for several hundred years, and if anything, has got faster. And I don't know if or when this industrial revolution will finish, but I don't think there've been four or five of them. I think there's just been one, and we're still in it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yep. So that's my final contention in the book, and I added that it's perhaps a bit of an outlier, but I felt I really needed to say that because
No.
I was laughing when I was hearing about this fourth or fifth industrial revolution or something. So no, there's just one.
Yeah, you can't really quantify that. Like when the
When
idea
you
that your technology kind of spikes in that way, and it kind of keeps on going on that upward slope. There's no end point, basically.
Exactly, that's right.
Is kind of
It
measure.
it may it may be that it slows at some point, 100 years from now, 500 years from now. I wouldn't be surprised if innovation, it would be a case of I've forgotten the particular term I was going to use, but basically it would be less and less. It would be, no, I can't think of it. There would be less and less value squeezed out of the of the money that's being put in it into innovation. It'll be harder and harder to innovate, and it'll be more and more costly. And I think at some point we probably will see a slowdown and some sort of
Hmm.
stabilization at some sort of advanced technological level. So, and implicit in that statement, of course, is I absolutely believe that we will not destroy ourselves. The contention, I've encountered many people, many of them feminists, not all, many, who believe that humanity will destroy itself within the next 50 or 100 years or something along those lines. Probably people 50 years ago thought it would happen within the last 50 or 100 years.
Right.
The last century or so has been full of those sort of arguments. They thought that Malthus proposed that we would eventually all starve, and that was something that was considered to be a very real risk as recently as the 1980s and so forth. Never happened. I don't believe we will destroy ourselves. That doesn't mean we won't harm ourselves. That's certainly
Yeah.
possible. There could be a nuclear war, and we could see billions of people dead, unfortunately. But society will go on. We could even knock it back. We could lose a bit of high technology for a while, but eventually it will recover. We'll go
Right.
on.
Yeah.
Uh,
One thing I've noticed is, the people who kind of make these hypotheses all the time are usually the kind of people that kind of want to see us gone.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. There is certainly, and they may not admit it, but I definitely see where you're coming from. Many of them, as in, they tend to be feminists a lot of the time. There is actually a movement within environmentalism for voluntary extinction.
Yep. That's the
It's
one.
it's a very small, relatively small movement. And while a lot of the people I've known who said these things weren't themselves supporters of voluntary extinction, they perhaps weren't necessarily that far from it either. So
Mm.
yes, they do, and I think to a certain extent, I think it involves a certain lack of imagination too. So uh, we are the end result of an unbroken line of reproduction, sexual for the last billion years, and before that, asexual, going back to the origin of life. The
Yeah.
genetic line we are part of has never gone extinct, right?
Hmm.
And they point to the number of extinctions that exist. And that is true that many species do go extinct, right? But if you look at those species, they tend to be fairly specialized, and they tend to have a fairly narrow geographic range.
Right.
If you look at the species that have a wide geographic range, they tend to still be around. Cockroaches, for example, which have a very
Hmm.
wide geographic range,
Yep.
have been largely unchanged for 100 million years. They're essentially very well adapted to their environment, right?
Yep.
And they have a wide geographic range, and then they're not going extinct anytime soon.
Hmm.
And I would suggest we have a wide geographic range as well, and amongst the widest. And for that reason, and for other reasons, such as our ability to innovate and adapt, we're not among those species. We don't have the characteristics of a species which is likely to go extinct, I think.
Right. I completely agree with that.
So, short of, and I've said, and I used to say this sort of 40 years ago, if the universe drops in a large enough rock on us, we're done, right? But it's unlikely to happen. Okay.
Well, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Eventually, we'll get an off-world colony. Might be 100 years from now, 1,000 years
Yep.
from now. Sooner or later, we'll have an off-world colony that's independent of the Earth, and then I think the universe is stuck with us.
Yeah.
I don't think we're
I
going any.
completely agree.
I don't think we're going anywhere. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I think, we're imaginative enough to resolve the radiation problem, I think, because the universe is bathed in radiation. So that's the kind of the big
Yes.
argument against the possibility of us colonizing other planets. But this is not us ignoring it. I'm just saying we'll probably figure out a way around that.
That's right. And to the extent that we've encountered it so far, we've already figured out our way around it. And it's certainly, you're right, it makes things harder, but it's an engineering problem, not a physics problem.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
it's about sufficient shielding and so forth. And yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Terraforming, I think terraforming is potentially quite a realistic prospect.
Hmm.
Not in the next 100 years or 500
Of
years,
course.
maybe,
Yeah.
but 1,000 years, 5,000 years from now, I wouldn't be surprised if we have the ability to terraform planets. And yes, absolutely. We'll find ways of addressing these problems,
Yeah.
in space colonies, you
Yeah.
can address these sort of
The
problems.
moon for sure. I think we'll be on the moon in a colonizing context in like the next 2 centuries maybe.
Yeah, exactly, and that's right. It may not be in our lifetime.
Mhm.
I would love it if it was. May not be,
Yeah.
but yes, sooner or later we'll get there. And we're talking here about a few hundred years. Our species they now think has been around about 300,000 years and probably behaviorally modern for about 50,000 years. 100 years is nothing. 200 years is nothing.
Yeah, I agree.
Before we get there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that did end up turning into quite a lengthy
Well,
discussion, didn't it?
well, I'm glad for that because I'm always nervous about this kind of stuff, especially towards the beginning. This episode's gonna suck. I got nothing to say, man. Like, but I usually pick up and something
Yeah,
does get said, and it does kind of snowball into something.
exactly.
So,
I simply pick up from what I'm preparing in the book and use that as a basis for the areas I want to talk about. Thank you very much. We'll talk again in 2 weeks. Bye bye.